Okay, good evening. This is John Bushka, and that's a picture of McCollum Hall at the University of Kansas as it was in the past. I think it's been replaced now, but I lived on the other side on the ninth floor when I was a grad student there for 2 years. I want to talk about that a little bit. And just one other, that's Fort Jackson, South Carolina, the entrance gate where I had basic training. That's a picture from 2015. But I'm going to just show you, continue with the oral history from William and Mary and talk about my time in graduate school and in the Army. And it's kind of an interesting story. So let's have at it. I've got to find the place it starts at 1 minute and 40 seconds, 1 hour and 40 minutes. I'm sorry, in this state, 1 hour and 40 minutes. Interesting thing is the first day that I got there, after, you flew into Kansas City, it was bitterly cold in Kansas City, it was like 10 degrees or something. You got a bus to Lawrence and got a taxi to the room and got the room assignment. I got up to my room about probably 9:30 at night, that first night at Central Time, and I had the room to myself for maybe 40 minutes. And then the roommate shows up. And I thought, oh no, it starts all over again. So that's the end of almost like the first feature movie. That's the end of, that would be a way to end the movie, wouldn't it? To start a roommate and then wonder what happened. Well, that's the sequel.
Well, did you have a lot of fear?
No, not really, because I was older and more mature.
Sure.
Now, it did not seem, a lot of boys, I did make some friends there pretty easily. And a lot of the boys, some of them were very preoccupied with scoring, and some of them weren't. But a couple of them were rumored to be homosexual, And then it was not feared as much as it had been. Now, this
Just
is
a few
1966.
short years, things are different.
Yeah, even without Stonewall, things were changing. Now, I had a roommate who was a freshman that I'm pretty sure was gay. The fall of 1966, the fall, not the spring, but when I went back for the second semester. Then I want to talk about the teaching in just a minute.
Sure.
But this guy was like 6'5" and very strong and very athletic. But then he sort of started dropping hints that he was gay. He was a freshman. And he was a good student. And then he wanted a room for this other guy that probably was gay that they were attracted to, so they did.
Okay.
But this was a very strong, big, strong, masculine-looking and acting guy. But he said that he was gay. So then it was starting to become acceptable.
And that's interesting that things have changed so much
in just 4 years.
But I do know from your book that you still did encounter a guy who was very homophobic in your dorm there.
A few. And then what then happened, I was an assistant instructor, and this is where it gets interesting, because I was teaching remedial math. Well, the math I was given to teach was algebra, but it was not the more advanced course that you got full credit for. If you took this course, they added 3 credits requirement to your graduation. But the tests, the first time, and they had a syllabus, and the syllabus called for them to have a test like the middle of the third week, the first, which was like the end of February. And the problems I made the test up on a mimeograph. I asked them to state the associative law, state the commutative law, state 3 or 4 things, and then just little problems of combining like terms. There were like 20 questions, and they had 50 minutes. And the grades were so horrible on the test that some of the people could not grasp the abstraction of algebra at all. They would get 0. And then it started. Then the downslips came, and I gave some people ground slips. Then I caught somebody cheating because I saw that he had copied this other answer that was wrong from this other girl's. So I told him that I had to flunk him, and this was it because I caught him cheating. And he came up to the dorm and begged. But then there were complaints about me for the tests were too hard, and I sort of resisted the complaints, which I had no right to do because they're the boss. I have to do what I'm told. I admit that. I didn't have a right to really resist what I was told to do. And I accept responsibility for that. I was relieved of my teaching because of my reputation. But then I got this and then I worked as a computer programmer for 2 of the semesters. But I got the teaching assistantship back in the fall of 1967. So that time, the tests were a little easier, but that time I taught the 2 sections with no complaints at all. So the interesting thing then was, as you come into 1968, I took the master's orals, which were a little bit rough, but then I passed, and I was going into the circle. Oh, the other thing I have to mention, I took the draft physical 3 times. That's in the book.
I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I took the draft physical. I took it. I took it in Richmond would have been in 1964.
Yeah.
And that was when it was. They asked if you had homosexual tendencies, but the other thing is that they herded the people in a room, and everybody was undressed in a room. And you could see this was a real spectacle. They didn't do this the other time. You could see that there were like 100 people in the room. You could see that one or two of the people didn't have normal genitalia. In an Army draft physical, you could actually see that.
So your first draft is in September 1964.
Yeah.
And you tell the Army.
Yeah, when I'm asked, and then I'm made 4F. But so then I decided
What does that mean for the audience?
4F men disqualified for service for medical or moral reasons. Totally unqualified.
Were you surprised by that? How did it make you feel?
I thought it was dangerous because what's going to happen later on when I have to have a security clearance?
You were worried that this was
Yeah, so I was worried about that. So I decided I would take the draft physical again in 1966. It went from 4F to 1Y, but they did not ask any.
And what is 1Y?
1Y was only called up if necessary. Okay. I don't quite know why it was 1Y, but they did not ask in 1966 if you had homosexual tendencies. Oh, it's because you had had psychiatric treatment before.
Okay.
But I didn't disclose the reason for the psychiatric treatment. They didn't really ask. It just made you 1Y. But then the third time I took the physical was in September of 1967 and went down to Richmond. So the second time was in Kansas City. The third time the last time I took it was in the summer of, I was still a graduate student, but I guess I took it right before the last semester. And I was 1A then because they didn't ask any. They accepted the fact that you had psychiatric treatment. You still were 1A.
So you go through the draft board 3 times because you're trying to clear your name.
Clear your name. Yes.
But how did you feel about the war? Were you
I thought this is the thing. I had taught students at the last semester, and this time they didn't interfere. I probably had probably a third of the students, but maybe a little more than a third got Fs in my course because they were that bad. They were really bad, And then there were a lot of Ds, but if you flunked out of school and you were a male, you were more likely to get drafted, and you were more likely to get combat arms and be sent to Vietnam to fight. You're more likely to become cannon fodder, basically. And so that's how it was. So I was participating in a sense on the other side of the fence. I actually had the agency or the authority to expose somebody to a greater risk of being drafted by the grade I gave him.
But if I read your book correctly, you also had volunteered for like.
Well, okay, this is the thing. I had talked to recruiters and asked what would happen if I just allowed the draft to happen. And it was said, well, one of them in Arlington warned me that 95% chance you'll get combat. And so I volunteered for the draft for 2 years on the theory that it would get me might give me a softer assignment. And that worked. But in the meantime, I wound up at special training company in basic training.
So you do receive a draft notice?
Yes, I do, but I go 2 weeks early.
Okay.
I go down on February the 7th of 1968. And Ted has already happened.
Sure.
And in the Vietnam War. And I get there too late, so they send me to the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond, which then had not yet been renovated. Like it is now, it's a luxury place, but then it wasn't. And I'm in a room by myself, and real late, I went to a movie. I went to see Valley of the Dolls, and I come back to the room, and shortly after I get back to the room, another guy shows up to be the roommate, and he's disfigured. He's going to be drafted, but he's disfigured because of laboratory burns in a chemistry lab accident. That's the weirdest thing to expose to the day before you go into the Army. I mean, this is just so many weird coincidences. But then the next day I get inducted, and then I go on the bus. You're put on the bus. They give you a meal ticket in the Greyhound bus. You get your supper free. The bus leaves at 6, and you're at Fort Jackson around 1:30 in the morning. I remember the ride very well, the mileage signs to Fort Jackson. I remember what it was like the first few years and the first few hours in the Army were like, and that's all in the book. But winding up in special training company because of the physical combat proficiency test. And then 4 weeks of that, I got myself out of it. I didn't improve my physical strength a lot. I got so I could do the overhead bars correctly, not just one hand at a time, but hand over hand quickly. I got much better. About the third week, it started getting much better. And then I did the rest of basic when I went back to a new company. We started back at week 3. It was better. But there was one guy who made a pass at me, a black guy made a pass at me in the dorm, and I just refused. But the guy that made the pass was the guy that scored 500 on the PT test, too. So,
were you still afraid of your sexuality coming to light, or
a little bit. But so I was hiding. I was just simply not saying anything.
And of course, we'll jump ahead later to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But what was the explicit policy on homosexuality?
Okay, what happened was that they stopped asking sexual orientation because they didn't want people getting out of the draft. So they already had Don't Ask, Don't Tell them without ever having announced it. From 1966 on until the end of the Vietnam War. Then they started asking again after Nixon eliminated the draft. In 1969 they went to a lottery system. Remember, in December of 1969, sure. They started asking again and started getting more rigorous throughout I guess the 70s. Then before Reagan came into office, they wrote this memo that homosexuality is incompatible with military service, the famous 125 words. And so, which I can't repeat exactly, but I think it's in the book. And they claimed that it was, unit cohesion and this kind of stuff. But also the idea that if you think somebody is attracted to you, that's unacceptable in an intimate environment. Or because it also means if somebody's not attracted to you, that means there's something wrong with you. It works both ways, and the meaning that other people will attach to it is disruptive in a military environment.
Well, again, I still think that that kind of thinking is really behind some of gender ideology today, because some people don't like the situation they're in. They can't do as well if they're men, particularly young men, if they're not going to be able to do the things that are expected of young men as well as others can. It may be to their advantage to be called something else. Now, that's probably not true, because if you, this is venturing a little bit, but if you do, let's say you get puberty blockers and you don't develop normally, you're not going to look as mature. You're going to be even more disadvantaged as a teenager because of how you look. And then if you do transition, you're not going to be as natural what you transition to as somebody who was biologically. You're still going to be at a disadvantage. Okay. And so they seem that it's a badge of honor to call yourself trans as a social contagion. But seriously, I think there are some people who have a brain issue where maybe there's something that's valid, but I think that it's also very rare. And so there are not enough people for when that's true that you can have a political movement based on it. Their homosexuality is very common. Truly being trans is just not very common. And so it's not enough to have a revolutionary movement unless you can get other people to join. And I honestly think that's what's happened. I hate to, and a lot of people don't like to hear that, but I honestly think that that's what happened.
Okay, so picking back up here for part two, we sort of left you in the Army during the Vietnam era. I believe you had just finished basic training and were sent to the Pentagon, is that correct?
Right.
And what were you doing at the Pentagon?
Okay, at the Pentagon, we were in a group of people that studied force development, of combat support and combat service support, as well as combat arms itself. In the E-ring, we may have been in the part of the Pentagon that was hit on September 11th. I think we were. And we didn't really do a lot. We just made a lot of charts and lists and so forth. We didn't really do a whole lot. I was theoretically living on South Post, but actually my parents were home. So sometimes I went home to my parents, but we had some activities. We had a chess tournament one time. And one time I played a game on at Fort Myer in front of somebody else from the D.C. area. We were playing a match, and I beat him, and there were about 40 or 50 people came in the room to watch the chess game. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So, but then, excuse me, but then, when I get this call from somebody that I might be getting transferred soon. This other soldier just calls me one day at the office. And then finally the colonel calls me and says, yes, this is true. You could try. And eventually I get transferred to Fort Eustis. And the obvious answer is that something went wrong with the top secret security clearance. That would be the obvious
And you
question.
Suspect that is because of
But I wasn't told that exactly, but I suspect that that's the reason.
And do you think your supposed psychiatric problems,
Yes,
your
yeah.
stay at NIH, had followed you?
Yes.
Wow.
But they made up reasons, and then one day later on, somehow I came back. I don't remember how I did, but one day later on when I was at Fort Eustis, I came back. And the person I had been replaced, and somebody was very nervous that I even came back in the room. But in Fort Eustis, once I got to Fort Eustis, I had to actually theoretically have the security clearance all over again. And this time I was interviewed by a psychiatrist who didn't have any problems at all with me. He didn't ask about homosexuality. He didn't find anything wrong with me, and he thought it was like the whole thing was a sham.
Yeah.
And so, but I was kind of sheltered from going into combat. This was the United States Combat Development Command Transportation Agency at Fort Eustis, which is only 10 miles from here, actually in the city of Newport News. And we were in this white building, one-story building, where we were also in the eyebrow, they call them eyebrow barracks. Which are across the yard. And that's all been replaced now by a huge low-rise 4-story building. If you've ever been on Fort Eustis, you will see it someday. We didn't really do a lot. I helped run a couple of chess tournaments on the post. Maybe that's serving your country. I don't know. Probably is. I did that, and I played in the Armed Forces Championship. We went to Fort Meade in Maryland for the week, and I actually had a room in the barracks there. And I think I got 3.5 out of 6 points in that tournament. But then in December, before my getting out, we had a tournament in Newport News. And I played the Armed Forces champion, who was armed at the time was Charles Powell, in the 3rd round, and I actually beat him. And everybody was shocked because I was rated much lower. It was just like a football game, anything can happen in any given day. Anything can happen, just like it does in pro football. And he made an unsound sacrifice. I still remember sacrificing my queen, and because the force of mate caused him to lose a piece, and I won the game. He just missed one thing, and somehow I beat him. But I didn't do that very often. I didn't beat masters very often, but this time I did, and everybody was shocked and watching. But it happens, just like it happens in pro sports.
Sure. So one thing that stuck out to me in your memoir was that kind of in the Army, you almost describe your sexuality as an open secret, and you have this line where you say, William and Mary had kicked me out, but the Army would not.
Yeah.
And it seems like no one was really asking too many questions. I mean,
that's right.
Don't ask, don't tell. But to what extent had, you're much older. What role did your sexuality play? How much of a secret were you actively keeping at this point?
Okay, what happened was I started working when I got out of the Army. The first job was that I had really good interviews because I had that master's thesis. I did a technical talk at RCA up in Princeton, New Jersey, and the first job was the Operations Research Career Program.
Okay, that's where I'm going to stop right here. And then the next video will be about my work career starting. But that's my graduate school and my time in the military. And I do thank you for listening.